Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jamie Wright, and I am a digital associate at The Space. I will also give you a visual description. I'm a white man in my 30s with brown floppy hair and patchy stubble. Today, I am delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, Commissioning Digital Content, with our very special guest speaker, Russell Dornan. This is the first in a series of webinars designed for West Midlands Library Services on how to create your own digital projects. It is also my first time running a webinar, so please bear with me if the tech goes a little wobbly. It is my genuine pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Russell Dornan joins us today from the National Library of Scotland, where he is Senior Content Designer and General Lovely, Lovely Person, which is his official title. So I will just pin Russell over here, and then I will hand over to you. And Russell, I think you're good to go.
Hi everyone, is that me on screen and ready and great?
Yes.
Thanks Jamie, that's really helpful. So I'm going to be talking a bit about commissioning digital content. So before I do just a visual description of me, I am also a white man in my 30s. I have, I guess, light brown hair, scruffy on the top, shaved sides, a short beard, and yellow glasses. I'm also rocking, depending on your age, Madonna mic or a Britney mic. So yeah, that's me, and I will now share my screen and get into the webinar proper. So bear with me. Okay, Jamie, is that all good? Is that coming through okay?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Perfect. So as I say, we're here to talk about commissioning digital content. And I'm going to sort of talk about inspiration for formats, themes, and ideas. So before I crack on, I'll just give you a quick overview of what I'll be covering. So I'll introduce myself first of all, then I'm going to talk through some different formats, sort of content types across different platforms. I'm then going to go into various case studies across the different places that I've worked before I then do a very brief summary and allow time for questions at the end. So let's kick off. Who am I? Just an existential question to start with. So as Jamie said, I'm the senior content designer at the National Library of Scotland. But before that, I started my sort of cultural digital career at Wellcome collection in London, where I was there for a few years before moving to V&A Dundee, and then moving on to National Museum Scotland. And before all of these, I sort of really cut my teeth in the museum sector in the West Midlands randomly, where I trained to be a sort of collections and curatorial person with Herefordshire Museums Service as well as Shropshire Museum Service. So it is a pleasure to be speaking to people in the West Midlands today. So across all of these roles, I've essentially been responsible for managing websites, the editorial sort of narrative content, whether that's blogs or sort of articles, as well as social media. I've recently moved on to the National Library of Scotland. I've been there for 7 months, and I believe unless you've been there for at least 10 years, you're still considered new. So I'm very, very new there. And this is a slight change in some ways for me because although it's still digital content and I'm managing website and website content, I no longer look after social media, which sits in a completely different team at the library. But I can still reflect on my previous roles and the work I've done there, which is what I shall be doing shortly. So that's who I am. So I'm going to start by talking about formats. So there are lots of different types of formats. I'm going to talk through a lot of them in a second. But these different formats work for different audiences. So who are you trying to reach? What kind of formats work for them? What kind of stories are you trying to tell? Again, that will dictate in some ways the formats that you can use. And then the platforms as well. So where are you telling these stories and what do they need in terms of format? So when you're thinking about what format to use, there are all these sorts of questions you can ask. So who are you trying to reach? Are there particular demographics or types of audiences that you want to target with your content? So have a think about that. And that again will it'll sort of lead you down a path of, the formats and the platforms and that kind of thing. What stories are you trying to tell? Is this sort of promotional stuff? Are you trying to get people through the door? Is it just really interesting storytelling related to your themes or collections or work? Have a think about those. For the audience you're trying to reach and the kind of stories you want to tell, where will your stories land best? Some types of stories will be better suited to certain formats and certain platforms, so that's something to think about. What's the impact that you're trying to have with any of this digital content? So instead of just coming up with an idea that you think would be great or something that you personally would enjoy, um, think about what you're trying to do with it. So is it about promotion? Is it about storytelling? Is it about sharing some information with, for example, funders or other stakeholders who can help your organization in different ways? And then sort of underlying all of this is, what is your USP? So what is the unique selling point for your organization? What is the kind of content that only you can do rather than any other library or cultural organization out there? What do you have that no one else does? And that can be a whole range of things. It can be the collections that you look after. It can be the staff that work for you. It can be the location you're in and the environs. It can be all sorts of different things. It can also be whatever maybe is happening at any given time. So maybe there's an exhibition that you have in, or there's an event that you've got going on. There can be all sorts of different things that mean that you have a story to tell in a way that only you can. So I'm going to go through some of these format types. I'm going to start with articles. So when I say articles, again, this can be sort of a blog post all the way to sort of a long form, more journalistic sort of type approach, or creative writing. It could be all sorts of different things. But in its broadest sense, the articles that we can create for digital content for our cultural institutions can be done in various different ways. So they can relate directly to your program, your events, your exhibitions. They can instead use collections or displays as a jumping off point for your content, or they can relate to the organization's wider themes and aims, but otherwise be quite tangential, which allows you maybe a bit more flexibility to find unexpected ways in to digital content and therefore into your work. So a couple of examples of these. So these are two examples of articles that are directly linked to the program. So the article on the left is from Wellcome collection, and it's a natural hair piece, which relates to their, I think it's their current exhibition about beauty. And then on the right, there's an article about, I think it's a back and forth interview with Billy Connolly, because I think one of his kilts was in the V&A Dundee's recent tartan exhibition. So this allows a deeper dive into the subjects of the exhibitions that are on. So if people are able to visit the exhibition, this can allow them to have a deeper connection and dive a little bit deeper into some of the stories that maybe aren't able to be told in the exhibition itself. If people aren't able to go to the exhibition at all, then this is a really great way to share the content and share the thinking around this topic with people, no matter where they are in the world and whether they can visit or not. And of course, for a lot of people, it'll be doing both of that. It'll be giving them that depth, maybe even lure them in to come see the exhibition. So there's also a promotional element to all of this as well. Another example is sort of display inspired. This is very similar to the program inspired stuff, but this can be sort of more permanent things that are just always there. So on the left, this is a piece an article all about this object at Wellcome Collection, which is in their permanent display. So again, for that, you're sort of looking at, I guess, raising awareness that that's something that people can come and see, and this is the kind of story that it's telling. And again, for people who aren't coming or aren't able to visit at all, they're still able to understand who the organization is, what they stand for, and the kind of topics that they explore because of articles like this on their website. Then on the right-hand side is a V&A Dundee piece from their permanent display, which often has rotating objects in and out, partly to keep it fresh for visitors, but also in terms of collections care. Some objects can only be displayed for a short amount of time. So this article is about the lavender labels strand of objects, which is a bunch of LGBTQ plus related objects that are shown in the permanent display. So this article is doing multiple things. Again, it's giving a platform for those stories, and which is great for representation. It's also sort of, I guess, leading with their chest a little bit about what's important to this organization. So it's making clear that actually this audience is a priority for the museum and that this audience therefore is valued. But also it's just sharing this information with anyone who's looking for it. So there's that element too. It's not all about getting people through the door. It can just be about sort of raising the profile and showcasing these kinds of stories, which is super important. And then you have the slightly more tangential stuff, which is maybe linked to wider themes. So on the left is a National Museums Scotland blog post, which was written about Madonna. This did in fact link to their temporary exhibition, which was about the little black dress and the history of it. But this blog post is very much looking at Madonna's career through the lens of the little black dress. So it's an engaging and relevant way to reach an audience in a different way, I guess. So instead of just saying, this is a little black dress, this is the history of this garment or this kind of garment, instead it's using Madonna and sort of that pop culture reference to lure people in, and also to be a bit more unexpected and a bit more relatable than just a straight up monograph of the history of an object. Similarly, on the right hand side, that's another National Museums Scotland blog post. This is one I wrote. About Jurassic World film, the latest Jurassic World film. The person who I interviewed for this actually is the scientific advisor for the Jurassic World films, and he happens to be a research associate at the museum. So it was a perfect opportunity when that film was being released to sort of ride that wave of it being in the sort of public consciousness. By speaking directly to someone who worked on the film and I guess marrying the science with the sort of bombastic cinematic spectacle, putting that in a blog post for people to enjoy. Again, sort of instead of just talking about dinosaurs. This is maybe a bad example because dinosaurs are just super cool, but instead of just talking about dinosaurs in a really sort of dry and natural science way, actually using the lens of cinema um, to sort of act as a vehicle, I guess, for getting people into our collections and understanding who the National Museum Scotland is and the kind of collections they have and the work that they do, including working on films like this. So another format type that I'm going to talk about is videos. I'm going to touch on a very specific case study later in this talk, so I won't say too much here. But videos they're a great medium in many ways. They're really immersive and dynamic, but they can also be quite resource intensive. But whether you're working on videos like National Museum Scotland on the left, on YouTube with sort of regular, consistent, high quality videos, or something more like the National Library of Scotland in the bottom right, where it's a short one-off series looking at a very specific subject matter, in this case LGBT plus histories. YouTube is a great platform and probably the platform to explore doing that with. But then you also have Instagram, which you can do similarly high quality videos, but you can also do a little bit sort of rough and ready, sort of more accessible videos on there too. So the top right, that's Vinnie Dundee's Instagram Reels section. So again, that can be sort of very high quality, but you can also be a little bit more relaxed with it too. So webcomics, this is maybe a bit of a random one, but it's something I worked on when I was at Wellcome Collection, and I took it with me to Viennese Dundee as well. And it's just a really lovely medium for exploring the subject matter that your organization is involved in. So on the top left, the two webcomics there by Rob Bidder. This came about because Rob Bidder, who I'll talk a bit about later as well, he was a front of house member of staff at Wellcome Collection and Library, and he happened to be a really talented illustrator as well. And so he had a regular web comic which was published on Wellcome Collection social channels as well as on the website. And since I've left many years ago, the angle that they've taken now is to actually commission multiple different illustrators over time. So here's a selection of those illustrators who have, I suppose, been a bit of an illustrator in residence at Wellcome Collection over the years. And as you can hopefully see from some of the panels, it deals with various aspects of Wellcome Collection's sort of subject matter in a way that's a little bit different to like a long form article or a video or something that's quite glossy. And maybe quite worthy. So I think something like comics and sort of the funnies is really interesting vehicles for cultural organizations to explore, because it's relatable, it's immediate. You can play with the style and storytelling and all these other things. So I'm really fond of this sort of approach. So much so that, as I say, I sort of did it when I went to V&A Dundee. I did this in a different way though. I collaborated with the local uni in Dundee, which has a comics and graphic novel undergraduate and master's course. And so we provided a brief to the students working on the course that year, who then pitched to us, and then we worked with them over the year as their client. Which was a really great way for a design museum to work with sort of local students, and also get some amazing content out of it too. Whereas Wellcome Collection's webcomics were very much about the subject matter that Wellcome covers. With V&A Dundee, because it's a design museum, I was much more interested in the format and the medium as a piece of design. So the individual webcomic runs that the students did were about all sorts of different things. They weren't focused on design themselves because they were sort of by default a piece of design, and so that offered us lots of different opportunities for storytelling that way. So video games. This is another one of those maybe slightly random ones that maybe feels like it can take a lot of resource to produce, and that is true to an extent. I wanted to touch on it because it's, again, a bit like the webcomics, it's just a different way to explore the themes and ideas maybe in a cultural organization that you're in, and bring that to the public in a really interesting and unexpected way. So this project, this game was called Plaything, and I commissioned this while I was at V&A Dundee. It linked to the exhibition called Video Games, which explored the groundbreaking design and the sort of impact culturally of contemporary video games. It was a really beautiful and poignant sort of web-based game, and just you can see clips of it here, sort of blending handcrafted sort of animation, but also generative art. We appointed the designers via an open call out, and eventually appointed the winning designers. Really great thing about this, and what this shares a little bit with the webcomics that I was talking about a second ago, is that it was an opportunity for V&A Dundee to really showcase that they're a living, breathing museum where contemporary design happens. It's not just about putting something from, I don't know, 19 oatcake into a glass case in a gallery. It's also about paying people and commissioning them to make new work and show that off. But what was really special about this project, apart from the really gorgeous game that they produced, is that it allowed us to explore the game making process with our audience. So again, being a design museum, the various steps involved in getting a video game from idea to reality is a really interesting one, and it's full of lots of different design disciplines. And this gave us the opportunity to do that, tell that story, but also to involve the audience in different steps. For example, playtesting early versions of the prototype and things like that. So it was a really beautiful way that we could demonstrate design in action in lots of different ways. This one had a fair budget associated with it, but when I was at V&A when I was at National Museum Scotland, I worked with University of Glasgow, who have a video games course, and similar to the webcomics, we briefed the students, and then they pitched their ideas and then worked them up into prototypes. And that didn't cost us anything but our time. So there are ways that you can do simple sort of video games in collaboration with others that won't cost you anything. So again, that might be worth exploring. So now we're moving to one of my favorite types. So fiction and creative writing. This is something that I haven't done much of, and I really want to do more. This project was done at V&A Dundee, and it was linked to the Hello Robot exhibition, which looked at science and fiction of robots, and how they exist in the world that we live in, and how they're changing it, and how they have already changed it in a big way, and how they might go on to do that. So as it says on the screen, the show explores some quite big things. So how pop culture shaped our perception of robots, the impact on industry, those blurred lines between human and machine. And again, we could have done something quite dry content-wise. We could have done essays about, conceptually about some of these things. But instead, I wanted to unpack these really big ideas in a slightly different way. And so what we did is we commissioned writers to respond to particular questions that were set by the show itself. And we asked them to respond to that through creative writing. So what the writers got, we paid them a fee. We also published the stories to our website. And we were also able to get budget to illustrate each of the stories as well, which sort of brought them to life even more. And in return, we got 4 really beautifully illustrated short stories that successfully explored humanity's potential robot future, which is just what we wanted. So these are just little snippets of those stories and those illustrations, but it was a really interesting project because it provided a way in for people that, as I say, wasn't just a dry sort of monograph about this particular philosophical idea related to robots or whatnot. It's sort of almost by not by accident, like almost by in the back door, sort of got people sort of thinking about these themes and these ideas instead of just telling them about them up front. And it really let the subject matter sort of shine and sing, and people could explore those themes in a more creative and unexpected way, as well as, of course, the pieces that we did that maybe were a bit more expected. But this was a really fun project that really allowed people to get closer to those themes in a way that maybe they wouldn't have been able to do had it just been a straight sort of monograph about those subjects. That brings us to social media. So this is a slightly tricky section because there's lots of different social media platforms and different types of content you can do within that. So I'm going to sort of cover it as best I can, and I'll mention some more case studies later on, but happy to take questions at the end if there's anything I haven't covered. But what is social media good for? I think this is something that we ask ourselves. Maybe we've been asking ourselves that for the last few years a little bit more. But it's a really powerful tool. And even though it feels a little bit like things are changing and that it's not particularly sort of, I don't know, maybe it's not quite what it once was, which I'll come on to. It still has such great potential for storytelling on those platforms for themselves. It's also great for information gathering on certain platforms. You can sort of go out to your audience and ask them things, ask them to weigh in on different subjects. I'll talk a bit more about that later too. Especially in the day, especially Twitter was really great for conversation and sort of posing questions or discussing subjects around maybe an exhibition or a book or a display or an event, and creating that sort of discourse on social. It's also brilliant for fun. I think maybe that is an element that I personally feel like maybe is being lost a little bit with social media these days. But a few years back, it used to be such a fun place to play. And then ultimately, I suppose what it's mostly used for is sort of promotion. But of course, arguably, all of the stuff I've just talked about is also promotion as well. But I think if you can sort of make the promotion almost be a between the lines thing that isn't your primary goal, and actually getting people to interact with you and engage with you and tell them a story, if that's your primary mission with social media, I feel like that's where you get a really good return. So just a couple of examples of some of the stuff I've just talked about. At V&A Dundee, there's no collection there to speak of. There's a permanent display of other organisations' objects. So whenever sort of milestones come up in the year or particular themes are happening on social, it was always a bit of a challenge to think about how we could sort of insert ourselves into that in an authentic and meaningful way. Whereas Wellcome Collection, with a huge collection of its own, you can just search for anything really, and you'll find something interesting to talk about. So I had to sort of think on my feet a little bit more at V&A Dundee, and this is an example of that. So for Pride Month in 2019, I wanted to do something that felt meaningful, despite us not really having any clear queer stories in the galleries. So instead, what I did, I broke down the pride flag into its constituent colours. I found a view or an object that related to that colour and explained what that colour meant. So that's what this series of tweets is. But then I ended it by talking about the pride flag itself and linking to an article on MoMA, who already had a really brilliant history of the pride flag. So again, bringing it back to design as a design museum. And then I also finished it off by talking about the at least sort of more new progress pride flag and linking to the design magazine Designs article. So even if you don't have a collection of your own that you can draw from and really confidently talk about, in this case, queer history or stories, there are always ways that you can sort of riff on it and bring that to light in a way that still feels authentic to use an organization. The National Museums Scotland, similar, using Twitter in this case to really tell a story, using the thread function to lead people down a bit of a rabbit hole, and using GIFs and pop culture references to sort of relate the collection history to them in a way that's maybe a bit more engaging or a little bit more relevant. And then this is a thread that I did about a Scottish wildcat, which specimen in the collection. I was with one of the curators one day. We were looking through the drawers and we saw that, and on the label, it basically mentioned that this was the Scottish wildcat specimen that had been donated to the museum, and this was the animal that had featured in the Ring of Bright Water book, which sort of blew my mind. And so I got the book, I had a look through, and lo and behold, there was this whole story about this Scottish wildcat in that story. And allegedly, the museum had that very specimen in its collection once it had died. Because it just to make everyone feel better, it was sort of rescued and held in captivity, and when it died, it was then donated to the museum. It wasn't captured and prepared, you know, it was all good, all kosher. But that story was super interesting, and just this sort of taxidermy skin lying in the collections. I could have just shared a photo of that and said, "Oh, isn't this funny? It was in the Ring of Bright Water," but instead, I broke it down using quotes from the book, photos from other bits and pieces from the story, to again bring that story to life for people and lead them through a bit of a tale. Bring them on a bit of a journey, and that's something that some social media channels can be really, really good for. Then I mentioned fun. So this is a thread that I did at Wellcome Collection on my very last day at that organization. And I mean, it's super simple, but it proved to be quite successful. And essentially, it was just a thread going through and quoting the Part of Your World song from The Little Mermaid. And I mixed it up with GIFs from the film, but also with objects and shots of the gallery, because the Wellcome Collection is full of weird and wonderful things, just like Ariel has in her collection. And so it just felt like a silly, fun, sort of off-the-cuff thing to pull together on my last day. And projects like this, even though on one hand it might feel quite trivial, at the same time, it sort of engages people and sort of tickles them. And so we had a lot of really great feedback and a lot of sharing, a lot of commenting on it. People just really liked the attention to detail, which I think is really important when doing stuff like that. And that brings me on to sort of pop culture stuff, where that detail and authenticity is really key. So when I joined V&A Dundee, there was a series of Drag Race UK airing, and there were two Scottish queens on that series, and there was a runway that they had to do, which was about, I think, their hometown or similar. So they had to pick something iconic, and one of them was from Dundee and picked Dennis the Menace, which is great because V&A Dundee has some of that in the gallery. So I put them side by side, and then the other Scottish contestant was from Glasgow and chose a Rennie Mackintosh design for their runway. So again, we happen to have something in the galleries for that too, being a Scottish design museum. So yeah, it's just finding those opportunities in a timely way where it feels authentic, and you get the details just right, so that when people look at it, it's pleasing, and it's, it doesn't have to be funny, but it can just, when it's accurate and it's done properly, it just feels right. I promise the whole presentation isn't about drag queens. But anyway, at National Museum Scotland, we did something similar. So we compared the drag queens to beetles in the collection. And again, maybe it sounds again quite flippant and sort of surface, and where's the sort of scientific rigor? But that's not what this piece of content is about. This piece of content is making our collections relevant to people online. And this is a trend, for those who might not know, this kind of approach is a big trend on Twitter, whether it's drag queens to Beatles or Kylie Minogue to shampoo bottles or whatever it might be. This was just as basically living and breathing on Twitter as the audience does. And again, it's when you find those really good matches, that's when it really comes alive, and is successful. And then there's this really successful tweet that we did at National Museum Scotland, where one of the people in my team was watching Line of Duty, and because Martin Compson is Scottish, wanted to tweet this, and as you can see, it did some nice numbers. And this kind of thing is just a little bit silly, a little bit fun, and just is a way of being relatable, I guess, to your audience. We don't just have to always talk with that singular authoritative museum voice. We can have a little bit of fun, especially on social media, where those platforms are sort of really benefit from that. So I'm just going to finish with the social media examples with probably one of my proudest tweets that I've ever done on the left. So in addition to having fun, you can also troll people you don't particularly like on social media too. So I should also caveat this by saying that unlike National Museums Scotland or National Library of Scotland or even V&A Dundee, Wellcome Collection is very independent. It's self-funded, all of these good things. So I wasn't beholden necessarily to having to toe the line in the same way that I would for a national organization, which is why I did a couple of tweets which sort of ape and I suppose take the mickey out of then President Trump and his bizarre sort of Twitter escapades. But again, the numbers sort of speak for themselves, and it's not just about that though. It's not just about getting high numbers, and I didn't tweet this thinking, oh, this will be great, this will get our stats up. It was about connecting with your audience and sort of, I guess, feeling a bit of a kinship, which is a tricky line to tread because of course not all of Wellcome Collection's followers maybe would align the way that I might align politically. But cultural organizations tend to gravitate, people tend to gravitate towards those organizations for certain reasons. And I think someone, a figure like Trump felt like safe fodder in the cultural sort of sector. So yeah, and then I followed that up a few months later with one mocking his Kofifi tweet as well. So having just trotted through a whole bunch of examples of social media, I just wanted to sort of finish this section by talking a little bit about, I guess, the other side of that. So there's a few things to think about when working on social media or thinking about storytelling and digital content on social. So in no particular order, new channels is a whole thing. So I've worked in digital long enough that I remember Instagram being fairly new and sort of jumping on that bandwagon. But then when Snapchat came about, that there were organizations leaping to be the first to take advantage of that channel. And then it was people realized, I think quite quickly, that all of these new channels need resource, need time, need effort. And so in the last however many years, new channels have often presented people working in this area with some challenges because there's a pressure and a temptation to get onto the new channel to reach those new audiences potentially, but that comes at a cost. And you're not optimizing your existing channels as much as you could be, or maybe you are, but by jumping to another channel, you'll be spreading yourself too thin. So just a bit of I guess a bit of a red flag in terms of when a new channel pops up. For example, TikTok a few years back presented the exact same sort of issue, with lots of organizations feeling the pressure to be on it, to be the next big thing on these channels, being an early adopter and really carving out a niche for themselves. If you have the resources and the time for that, then by all means, crack on. But you just have to ask yourself if it's worth that, especially because building an audience on social channels takes an awful lot of work. So you might be sitting on a decent following on a particular channel, and when a new one comes up, is it worth the trade-off to invest all of your time actually in this new channel where you don't have a built audience yet? And sometimes it will be worth it, but it's just something you need to consider. And that sort of takes us to resources. This isn't just for new channels, but for existing ones too. Spreading yourself too thinly just isn't a good idea in any situation, but especially with social media, especially because each individual channel really benefits from a sort of a tailored approach. And even though you can share stuff across the different channels, you at least need to be thinking about it for that audience and for that platform and tweaking it accordingly. Otherwise, you can sort of tell when something is just slapped on and isn't necessarily authentic or meant for that channel. But all of that takes time and resources. So maybe it's more important to think about which audiences you need to target or you want to target and where they are, and then prioritize that. Because trying to hit lots of people in lots of different places is really challenging. It's also really worth thinking about the audience you're trying to reach, because for years running social channels for organizations, I heard all the time, for example, that Instagram was where the young people are and that we have to be pushing certain content to Instagram for that. But when people in my organizations were saying that, it was already a bit too late. And actually, Instagram was already skewing a lot older than it had been when it started. Um, and even if lots of young people were still on the channel, they weren't using it in the same way that other people were using it or organizations were hoping they were using it. So you've always got to think about, who am I trying to reach? Where are they? And how do I reach them on those channels? That takes us to reach and impact. I mean, this is it's tricky to not talk about this too much, because when you're on social, you can see how many retweets or how many likes or how many shares or how many comments you've had. And these metrics are really helpful, but they can also be a bit of a hindrance. So sometimes if you get hardly any engagement, but you get one really amazing comment from someone, like one time I think I did a tweet and it didn't do very big numbers at all, but someone replied saying, "Oh, I showed this to my son. He can't wait to come to the museum. He wants to be an illustrator and he's really looking for..." Those kind of exchanges are really valid, and as valid as a tweet that gets 1,000 retweets. So always having that perspective and thinking about what you're trying to get out of the channels and of the social media content that you're doing. And but also, there's no point in some ways of doing something if you're not going to have at least a bit of a reach. So I guess this comes back to resources again and building that audience and building those channels up. In order for you to have a reach and have any kind of impact, even if it's not in big numbers, but just so anyone sees what you're doing, because nowadays you're fighting the algorithm, you're fighting people who are paying for the privilege of having their stuff shared more widely, all of this kind of stuff. It's just about thinking about what you're doing and doing it well and doing it for the right reasons. So the last two bullet points on this slide are a little bit trickier and a bit more complex maybe, but I put vibes because I wasn't quite sure what else to call it. But by that I mean, for example, Elon Musk taking over Twitter and it now becoming kind of, and even more so, a hotbed for sort of right-wing sort of doom and gloom and hate. And he's basically created a platform now that feeds feeds trolling, and lends itself much more to people who don't have any other kind of platform but sort of put money into this one and are able then to be seen by more people, leaving other organizations, for example, like libraries, museums, people who used to be sort of trusted sources of information. It leaves it much more difficult for them to be heard over and above that noise. It also caused, I mean, speaking specifically about Twitter and the Elon Musk of it all, that in itself just caused quite an exodus from the platform. So all of us using Twitter for our organization saw a big drop in engagement and in followers and so on as a result. So yeah, you just got to do a vibe check sometimes and wonder if it's still beneficial for you to be on these platforms. And there's nothing wrong with cutting your losses and focusing your efforts elsewhere. That being said, though, this relates a bit to ethics too, is that as organizations like ours, where we don't have a lot of money, and we don't necessarily have loads of channels to reach people, cutting ourselves off from free channels like social media can feel very risky, but it's always going to be a balance with what you're getting out of it as well. But yeah, the final one, ethics. I guess I've already touched on this, but in order to be heard above the noise, and for the algorithm to actually allow your content to reach the people you're intending to reach, more and more you need to spend money on that. So for example, with Facebook, I think an organic Facebook post with no money behind it will reach something like 2 to 5% of your audience naturally, organically. So if you want to reach more than that, you need to put money behind it. And while Facebook paying Facebook to boost your posts is incredibly cheap in comparison to other marketing costs, it still costs money, which not everyone has to spend on that. But also, what are the ethics involved in spending money with these platforms who, this presentation could be about the ethics, I guess, of social media, and it's not. But I think we're probably all quite familiar with, various things like Facebook influencing elections, or whatever it is that however you want to look at that. Do we as cultural organizations who are trying to share rich content with people and be sources of truth and trustworthy, all of these things, should we be spending our money with these companies? That is entirely dependent on each individual organization, and it's a balance again between being heard tall and how we feel about the ethics of everything. So I'll stop there about social media for now, but just a few things to sort of think about. So now I shall talk about a few case studies of content that I've worked on at the various places that I've worked. So I'm going to start with Wellcome Collection. So for anyone who doesn't know, Wellcome Collection is in London, and it's a museum and library which explores health and being human. It's essentially sort of a really creative intersection between science, medicine, and art. It's also independently funded and therefore has quite a lot of freedom to do some really cool things. So I was there sort of in the mid-teens, the early to mid-teens, where the digital landscape was a little bit different and maybe a little bit fresher. Especially social media felt more fun and more creative and more engaging, and a little bit less sad and bin fiery as it maybe does today. But I still think a lot of this is still true. So digital content really does offer us a way to speak to the audience, no matter who they are or where they are. And what's really interesting is that it can allow the audience to speak to us as well and weigh in on themes that we might be exploring too. And capturing their voices and sharing their insights is a really valuable part of that relationship. And it means that conversations can happen, but also inform some of the content that you create. And Wellcome Collection is all about the human condition. And so who better to tell those stories than, our audience, who are, hopefully mostly human beings. So the first case study I'm going to talk you through is called Museum Feels. So this was a project that I did for the permanent gallery, or one of the permanent galleries at the museum and library. It was called Medicine Man, and it was filled, you can see it in the back of the slide here a little bit, but it was filled with all sorts of different objects, from artificial limbs to sort of big ram heads, snuff boxes, to walking sticks, to all sorts of vaguely medical sort of paraphernalia, from witchcraft to, I don't know, specula, to all sorts of different things. And what I really wanted to do was bridge the gap between the gallery and our social media and the digital landscape we were in. And so the way that I did that was by putting up clipboards in the space, in the gallery space itself. So super lo-fi, and I just printed out on some A4 paper the prompt. I just wanted to know what the objects in Medicine Man made people feel. And then I gave them a hashtag, I gave them our handles, and hoped that people would see this and then respond on social media. And they did. So here are a couple of the posts that we got. So for example, the top left one, in Medicine Man Gallery, there's a black cat good luck charm, which was worn by a World War I soldier. And someone saw that and took a photo of it and then shared their grandfather's own black cat good luck charm, which he'd worn during the war as well. So this was a gift of a post from a member of our followers, really making that connection between what they see behind a glass case and their own family, their own lives, which is super lovely. And it just brings it to life a little bit more rather than just this, albeit sort of cute object behind glass, amongst lots of other objects. And so there's other, you can see the slide, you can see there's other responses. Some are funny, some are poignant, but it just is that nice connection. So what I then did with that is I printed those out onto paper, just in a normal printer, and put them in the gallery as well, trying to complete that circle of engagement. So it meant that people coming to visit the gallery, who were looking at the objects, would also see this wall of clipboards and be able to look at other people's connections to the objects in that space. And maybe that's all they would do. Maybe they would look at these and move on, and that's fine. Some people might be prompted, therefore, to or inspired to share their feelings as well. Um, but it just sort of added a bit more humanity, I think, in the gallery space, which otherwise was maybe a little bit stark. Um, but it also means that we can bring the objects to social media as well. So it's a really nice sort of feedback loop, of people sharing their stories and the objects being shared in context, through how people felt about them. And again, the only money I had to spend on this was the clipboards. Otherwise, everything was just printed paper and staff time. So another example at Wellcome Collection of that feedback loop, which I really enjoyed, is Curious Conversations. So this was a project that was done while Wellcome Collection was undergoing some refurbishment. So most of the museum and library was closed, but some of it was still open for people to come and see. And so the wall in the back of this slide that you can see, is a hoarding wall separating the space people could visit with the space behind which was being worked on. And instead of it just being a blank hoarding wall, we decided to make it a little bit more engaging and interactive. And that's how Curious Conversations was born. So the idea was that there was a magnetic whiteboard on the left, with a question, which people could answer, using those yellow bits of paper, and then use magnets to stick them on the board. And then the previous week's question that people had already answered, that was then illustrated by Rob Bidder, who I mentioned earlier in the webcomics. He then illustrated it on the whiteboard on the right-hand side. And this was just a really simple but sort of perfect way to engage people in the building and online in a very similar way. So if you visit the gallery and you saw this, you would see the question, you have a think about it and add your own answer or not. You could see the fun illustration that Rob had created from the previous question. But we also asked the question on social media too. So people could then feed into the conversation that way. And Rob picked his favorites from the yellow slips in the building, but also from social media. And then he illustrated them. And then we would share those, we would photograph them and share them back on social media too. So whether you're visiting in person or whether you can't, but you see us on social, we were able to sort of have people engage with us, and then we gave them something back, which was so important to us in that feedback loop that I was talking about. And although we had a hoarding wall which had been nicely designed and so on, this kind of approach could be done purely with a fairly cheap whiteboard that you put on the wall. And I guess what you need is someone who's able to illustrate things in quite a dynamic and sort of characterful way. But otherwise, it didn't really cost that much money beyond staff time. But yeah, you can see some of the examples here of some of the answers that we got to some of the questions we posed. It's just a bit of a special sort of loop, I think, of being able to ask our audience some really weird questions and get some really bizarre answers back, but then transform that into something meaningful, and then giving us content, and also giving people that desire, I suppose, to maybe engage with us in the hopes that maybe they will get illustrated. And even if they don't, or even if they don't care about that, they're still getting to see these really strange, fun things every week. So it's just about thinking about, like, what are the stories you can tell, or what are the ways you can involve your audience in a way that you can then do something with and then put back out to them. So pop culture is a source of content in museums and libraries and various cultural organizations, and we shouldn't be afraid of leaning into that. So this is one example. This is an article I wrote when I was at Wellcome Collection about Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Wellcome Collection and their parallels. This was super fun for me to write, but it was also a really good piece of content because it reached different people in various different ways. And so by using something as maybe flippant as Buffy the Vampire Slayer to use that as a lens through which to look at our collections, it actually gave me the opportunity to look at some of the objects in Wellcome Collections galleries and in stores that I wouldn't otherwise maybe have done, because maybe they just didn't have that same draw, or they didn't seem that exciting or whatnot. But by using a very particular focus, I found some of the things I'd never seen before, and I was able to relate it to people in a way through popular culture. So it was super fun to write, and we had some really great responses to it. But again, it's just an unexpected way for people to engage with the collections that isn't just a fairly standard, here's a book and it's been illustrated and this is when it was illustrated and who did it. Like, those are all important things to talk about here and there, but it's also important to sort of elevate that beyond the stuff that maybe researchers are interested in, and actually make it relevant to people's lives in some way, even if that's through sort of some pop culture moments. Speaking of which, I also wrote a Brittany blog post when I was at Wellcome Collection. Again, this was tied to Britney's ninth album being released, so there was a bit of a buzz around that. And so it's just identifying these moments where you can combine pop culture with your collections in a way that feels meaningful and authentic and timely. And also, not everything has to be super serious. And so for this, I just went through a whole bunch of Britney songs, I think about 12 or 13 of them, and then picked an object in the collection that related to it in some ways. So the obvious one here on the right is her song Toxic, and I chose a really beautiful arsenic bottle to illustrate that. So it's light-hearted, it's accessible, and sort of relevant to some people at least. It might not be as relevant to everyone. But then you can also, again, through the back door, you sort of sneaking in, well, these are things in our collection, and this is giving people a taste of some of the things that we have, and just the breadth of stuff that you can explore. There's also something to be said for an organization which, especially something like a museum or a library, where it's seen to be trusted and authoritative, but also in some ways, or with some people, it might be seen to be a little bit stuffy or a little bit old-fashioned, and actually turning that on its head a little bit and doing something that's a bit more unexpected, and sort of having fun with that. Some people will not enjoy that, and some people won't get it maybe, but a lot of other people will, and a lot of them probably wouldn't have engaged with the organization in that way necessarily before. So moving on to V&A Dundee. For those who don't know, it's an international design museum, and it's all about Scottish design as well as the best design from all over the world. And it is in Dundee, obviously. So the case study I'm going to talk about with this museum is an article series which really leans on personal connections. So the permanent galleries of Uni Dundee are full of Scottish design icons, and I suppose maybe more unsung Scottish design objects as well. So I wanted a series that explored these objects in a way that was light touch, shall we say. So just offering a glimpse into the galleries without being a really exhaustive monograph on each object. I wanted it to be regular. I wanted it to represent a range of perspectives as well. That was really key to this. I'm not a big fan of an sort of a singular authoritative institutional voice. I think of course, there's a time and a place for that, but I think we can really gain so much by breaking down those walls a little bit and presenting multiple perspectives and different viewpoints and personalities. And that's what this series was hoping to do. So this was a monthly article series. It would focus on one object from the permanent galleries each time. It was going to be short. By that I mean they were usually 300 to 500 words, 1 or 2 images max, and written by staff, at least at first. So that's what I was going for with this. I should also say that this series kind of happened by accident in some ways, because while I was or at least everything I've just said about wanting what I wanted this series to be is true, but the way that it manifested was almost by accident. So it was about a week before the museum opened in 2018, and I wanted to kickstart this series using Lemmings, the video game, which was on show in the permanent galleries of Uni Dundee. We had the basic info. That's available online as well. So, who designed it, that it was very popular, it was created in Dundee, all of that stuff. You can find that online. So I was thinking about, what can I add to this? What can I write that people can just find on Wikipedia or similar? Because there's just no point in duplicating what's already out there. So having heard all of this before and trying to think, I did some research, I tried to find new ways in, but there just wasn't that much that hadn't already been said about this game from 1991. So that led me to think about it in a different way. So instead of trying to find out more information about the game and just talking about those basic pieces of information, I sort of realized, actually, the more I thought about it, what kept coming to me was how I felt when I played the game as a kid. And so I started to explore that side of it. How did I feel when I played that game? And could I bring something like that to this article? And it sort of worked. And so I wrote the article with that, very much that in mind. So the object itself wasn't really the core focus of the article. It almost took a backseat to sort of me as a human being, having played it, the feelings I felt when I played it, and various other things related to that. And it gave me sort of a bit of a format, I suppose, and a little light bulb kind of went off. Like, actually, we don't need to be we don't need to be centering the object in everything. We could actually use the object as a prompt, or as it could be a part of someone's human story rather than the focus of the article itself. And that's how this series was born. So using that Lemmings article as a reference, I commissioned more from my colleagues. And the second one I happened to commission contained a really lovely personal reflection, which I wasn't expecting. And then the third one, again by coincidence, happened to be based entirely on a really unexpected connection that I didn't even anticipate. And by the time these three had been done, the series sort of manifested as what I've just sort of talked about, like this series of articles about these design icons in our galleries that really put the object in the background and put the person in the front, and really let people in to understand design and the impact and legacy of some of this design through very human stories. So, for example, the Basil Spence illustration that we had in, schematic that we had in the galleries. The person who wrote about that had visited Coventry Cathedral, also designed by Basil Spence, when she was a teacher, and she talked about the sensation and the feeling that she had when she was in that space. Also, the Basil Spence schematic that we had in the gallery was a kind of an ill-fated project. And so she reflects on that and how even though some things might not go right, you can still learn a lot from it. And she related that back to sort of young designers visiting V&A Dundee, which was really lovely. Then we had one about the Dounreay reactor, which was a super random one, which I overheard someone in the office talking about this, and I was like, "You're going to write this down for me." And basically, her grandfather worked at the reactor, and he moved there for that job with his then young family. And it was there that when his daughter was a bit older, she met her future husband, and they had Nicole, who ended up writing this piece. So without this reactor, Nicole wouldn't exist today. So that was a really nice and slightly random angle that we chose for that. But again, it's not about, there are still facts, it still talks about Dounreay, it still peppers it with some information, but it really centers Nicole and her relationship to this nuclear reactor in a way that you just wouldn't expect. This Christopher Kane dress, this was written about by Ilsa, and she studied fashion, and so she was a big fan of this designer. She was also really close to her brother, and the designer was really close to his sister. So there were all of these parallels that Ilsa saw when she looked at this piece that she then wrote about. And so this is very much about her journey to studying fashion and her relationship with her brother and how close they are and how supportive he was, which mirrored the subject matter as well. So again, just a glimpse into the people who work at the museum, super lovely. And translating these objects in a really real way rather than just sort of in a cold, detached, museumy way. And then probably my favorite one that we did, probably with my least favorite object in the gallery. So this was a salt sack that you probably just not even notice it if you walk past it in the gallery, but someone did notice it, and it was Mariam, and she noticed it because she herself is of Nigerian extraction, but she was born and raised in Dundee. Um, this company, the salt was from Nigeria, but the company was based in Dundee. And so when she saw this and she read the label, um, that was so vivid to her about feeling from two different worlds, but not really feeling fully in either. And she super articulately presented that in this article, which again is very much about her identity as a young Scottish person in Dundee with family ties in Nigeria, and what does that mean? And it's all these layers. And all of that really beautiful reflection came from this fairly unassuming salt sack in the gallery that I hadn't looked twice before. Um, and those are the things I really, really loved with this series. Um, so just to summarize the Scottish Design Icons article series, very much about putting the objects in the background and making sure that people are centered instead. The different perspectives that we managed to get were they were great, and some of them were really funny and really silly. Some were much more poignant, and it just paints this really diverse picture, I guess, of not just the people who work at the museum, but also the objects in the cases. It brings them to life in a way that I think transcends just them as objects behind the case, and really makes them be part of the fabric of someone's life, which is really interesting. And just a number of different connections was really exciting as well. Um, but it was a nice way to also showcase the teams and the people who work at the museum. And like any organization, there are multiple people there with different perspectives, and leaning on that can be a really exciting way to think about digital content. And again, it didn't cost anything because it was all staff that were writing it at that point. So again, a potential route depending on the kinds of things you're working on. So National Museum Scotland, again, for those of you who don't know, it's based in Edinburgh, although there are sites elsewhere. It has 5 collection areas, from natural history to art and design to Scottish history and so on. Over 12 million objects in the collection, and I think outside of London, it's the most visited. The main museum in Edinburgh is the most visited cultural attraction, which is kind of bonkers. So it's a big organisation, lots of stuff to see, lots of objects behind the scenes as well. I'm going to focus on video for this in terms of the format type. So I'm going to go through a couple of video projects that we did there just to demonstrate different levels of resource and effort needed. So a little bit about video first. I've touched on this at the beginning, but video can be a really great medium, as I'm sure we're all aware, for really dynamic content and to really immerse your audience in stuff in a way that maybe an article doesn't lend itself to for certain stories that you might want to tell. But at the same time, such a rich medium is that way because it's resource heavy and it can require a lot of expertise, can require budget to make it really glossy, really shiny. But it can also be done really quick and sort of fairly casually as well. And it depends on the platform and your approach, but audiences can be very forgiving, especially because everyone now has a smartphone and video content is so easy to create now that again it's a balance between what's accessible in terms of expertise and resource. Maybe you can make a decent looking video, but for some channels you might be looking to invest a bit more money or resource to make something a bit shinier and glossier because maybe that is what people expect. So it all depends on your approach and where you're trying to get your content out. So the first video project I'm going to talk about at National Museum Scotland is museum makeup. This is one of the favourite things I think I've ever done. I commissioned a makeup artist to take inspiration from the natural history collections and create 3 really beautiful makeup looks based on them. For a bit of context, the makeup artist who is in those clips, she's called Yongchin Breslin, and I don't know if anybody here watched Glow Up or any of the Glow Up series on BBC, but it's a reality competition with makeup artists, like proper talented makeup artists. Doing amazing work. Yongchin, spoiler alert, happened to win her season. She's also Scottish, and so one day I just had the inspiration that wouldn't it be amazing to have someone like her come in, get inspired by the collections, and then create these looks. We filmed the whole process. So Yongchin had a tour with the curators to see all the cool stuff, and then she created the looks. On the right-hand side, you can see the clip of Yongchin creating the mineral-inspired look on the mineral curator in the mineral store. So it's just a super fun day and really surreal and strange, but super fun. So here are the 3 finished looks, the mineral one in the corner on the curator, and then Yongchin went home and did the birds and insects inspired looks on herself and filmed those. And then we shared them across our various channels. We had a webpage on our website talking about it in detail. And I think the thing I've really enjoyed about this, aside from just geeking out over someone as cool as Yongchin creating these amazing looks, it was this sort of marriage of the collections and this sort of pop culture makeup moment, which was so fun. But also, I don't think I've ever seen a museum explore its collections in that way. So yeah, I got a real kick out of it, and our audiences were really big fans of it too. And the other benefit of it was we were able to work with Yongchin, who of course has a big following herself, and we benefited from her sharing it to her audiences. And we got lots of new audiences as a result of that as well, which is great. The big caveat to this, of course, is that this cost money. We had a content budget at National Museum Scotland, and I paid a decent fee for Yongchin to come and do this, and her travel and her accommodation, all of that was all paid for. So that's not maybe the most accessible way to do it, but I'm sure this is a kind of project that could be done in all sorts of ways, whether collaborating with colleges or schools or similar. There could be ways of doing that, but I'm presenting this one as sort of a slightly more budget and resource intensive version of a video project. So another project I'm really fond of at the museum was Museum Roll Call. So this was a series of films that I worked on where we filmed a range of staff walking through spaces that they work in, answering professional but also silly, stupid, random questions as well. They were all shot in one take, and they last between 4 and sort of 8 minutes each, depending on who they are and where they are. The idea being that we accidentally bump into one of these people, where they're working. So the two on screen at the moment happen to be curators, but we also filmed some front of house staff, some learning staff, and the director of the museum. We bump into them, by surprise, and then we just follow them and ask them questions for 4 or 5 minutes. And then we shared that across our various platforms. So the strength of this project is that it, similar to the Scottish Design Icons, but in a much more direct way, it highlights the people working across the organisation in different ways, from all the different positions that I just mentioned. So instead of always centering curators, which museums are sometimes tempted to do, it's a really great way to showcase people who work in all sorts of different roles and sort of demonstrate the kinds of things they get up to, whilst also showing off some of the really beautiful spaces that the organisation has to offer as well. So it really gives that human face to the organization. But what's also really great about this series is that it's really lo-fi and fairly quick and simple. So it can be done for almost no cost. I will say, just for honesty and transparency, National Museum Scotland has a multimedia producer on staff, and so he worked on this with me. So he's a skilled videographer, and of course that's why we have great results, and that's why it looks so good. However, you could just use your phone to do something very similar, and with a bit of practice, you would be able to produce something very, very similar for next to nothing. Because it's shot in one take, it requires very minimal editing as well. And then finally, going on to Instagram stories. So the two examples just given with video are slightly more polished videos that you would see on YouTube, for example. But the videos here in these clips were both shot on a phone, very rough and ready, just very simply done. So if you have a smartphone, you can film simple and fairly clean, high quality videos. There are loads of tools on your phone that can help with editing, and the apps themselves, like Instagram, also have editing tools, and there are things like Canva and other platforms that are free to use that can allow you to put together some decent sort of simple films. So again, as I was saying, on certain platforms, the expectation isn't that it's going to be a highly polished production. You can sort of get stuck in with your phone, and with a bit of practice and a bit of sort of looking at some guidance on YouTube and stuff, with some tips and tricks, you can actually produce really, really solid videos for no cost other than staff time. So I'm going to end this on where I currently work at the National Library of Scotland. So this is a reference library with a huge collection. It's Scotland's largest library and one of the major European research libraries. The four main collections are rare books, manuscripts, general collections, and moving image and sound. And we're also a legal deposit library, meaning we can collect essentially anything that gets published in the UK. I also realize I'm talking to library people, so maybe I don't need to explain any of this. I've only been here 7 months, so I'm still super new, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about narrative content and where we're at with that. So up to now, before I arrived, for many, many years, any kind of narrative content, and by that I mean sort of any kind of storytelling or interpretive content online, was made in a really fragmented way across the entire web presence. So there's just pockets of it all over the place. And it was never really done with the audience in mind. And so some of it's great, but just isn't seen. Some of it isn't so good. And I'm kind of fairly happy that it's not seen. But at the moment, we're really keen to rationalize all of that, make it user-centered going forward. So the kind of things we're asking is like, what do people need? What can we offer? We need to do some research. What's our unique selling point? What kind of formats do we want to explore, and what do we want to experiment with? So the work I'm doing at the moment is researching what people are looking for online on Google, for example, when they arrive at our website. So there are tools like Google Search Console, which is free, and that allows you to look at your website and how people are getting to your website and what they're searching for. So for example, I could look at a page on our website about the Jacobites, and it would then show me what people are searching for on Google to get there, how successful our page is at pulling them in, and all of that kind of stuff. So it can really tell you a lot about how people are currently coming to you and where you can improve and where there are gaps. And we're also reviewing existing content and seeing what worked, if anything, what can be repurposed maybe, and what gaps there might be that we can take advantage of to get more of an audience. And we can do that using things like Google Analytics, which is also free. We're right at the beginning of this journey, doing this research to sort of see where we're at. But the next steps is really about choosing a focus for the library's sort of digital content, for the editorial content. It's probably going to be Scottish related, but we're sort of narrowing that down so that we can carve out a bit of a niche for ourselves as an organization. Like, what can we do that no one else can really do in the way that we can? And then we want to focus that so that going forward, our editorial narrative content is done with that in mind and with an audience in mind. Part of that is deciding which content formats we want to employ. So in the beginning, we'll probably stick to articles, short form and long form, maybe some creative writing as well, but we're going to start fairly small. Hopefully that would expand to things like podcast or video or some of the content types I've been talking about today. But we really want to make sure that it's user-centered, that it's search engine optimized, which is usually shortened SEO. And for anyone who's not familiar with that, basically it means that when you create a page on your website, if you optimize it to be discoverable by search engines, which is done through various ways, such as using keywords throughout, using the right headings, using alternative text for images. There's all sorts of other ways to do that. But that means that when someone is searching something about the Jacobites in Google, if our Jacobite pages are really well optimized for search engine discoverability, it means that there's a much higher chance of people finding them and actually finding the content that we produce. So we want to make sure that going forward, all of this thinking is really key and central to any of the narrative content that we do. And that means we will be commissioning internally, but instead of maybe people just across the library writing whatever they fancy and putting it wherever they like, we're going to try and, we are going to create a section on the website, which is our narrative content section, and we will be commissioning people for that rather than it just happening serendipitously scattershot across the organization. And crucially, what we haven't done very much of, but we want to do, is to commission externally as well. So sometimes there'll be experts or whoever they might be, externally, whether they're really amazing writers or maybe they are makeup artists or, whoever they might be, we can commission them to create content related to that focus and that niche that we want to have and the stories that we want to tell. And all of that is about experimenting, trying different things out, and then really crucially analyzing the impact and reflecting on that, and then learning and putting all of that into the next iteration of what you're doing and developing that over time. So that's sort of the world I'm in right now. So having done all of these different content things that I've just talked about, I'm sort of at the library now where I don't run social media, and we're just looking at optimizing the website to be as useful as it can be for people. What do they need and when do they need it? So just before I finish, I'll just do a really quick summary of sort of the questions that I would think about when I'm thinking about doing digital content. So who are you trying to reach? Who are the audiences you're trying to get hold of? Who do you want to see this content? And why are you creating this content for them? What stories are you telling? What can your organization do that no one else can do? What is that content? So thinking that through. Where is the audience? There's no point in doing a story for an audience on your website if that audience exclusively searches for things, for example, on TikTok, which certain age groups do. And vice versa. So where are the audiences you want to reach? What's the impact that you're after? Do you want to inspire people? Do you want them to book a ticket? Do you want them to step through your front door? These are all valid reasons. These are all valid ways to have people engage with you. But the way that you create your content will help or hinder some of those goals. So have a think about that. What makes you unique? I've touched on this, but it's so important. Why is your organization doing this piece of content? What can they add to this conversation that is valuable that no one else necessarily can? And then ultimately, what's realistic? There's also, I'm sure you can all have 100 million ideas of all sorts of things you can do, but how much does it cost? How much resources does it take? How much staff time is required for it? Being realistic needs to underpin all of this, but thinking all of this through in the round will really help you hopefully land on pieces of content that will work, as long as you evaluate it and reflect on it and sort of feed that back as you continue working on it. That's also really important. That's the end. I'm aware I've just talked at you for an hour and 18 minutes, so I'm really sorry, but hopefully there was something useful there. And I'm very happy to take questions if I've missed anything or there's something else that you wanted me to talk on, if you want me to talk even more.
Russell, that was brilliant. It really was, and it's so beautiful to hear how enthusiastic you are speaking about, kind of even the lo-fi bits that you're doing, printing things on paper and putting them on clipboards, and using the staff that you have, to kind of tell their stories and really kind of focusing on centering people and how that can create connections. That's beautiful. Um, there's a question from Linda in the comments, which I think is a brilliant question. Where she said, I'd be interested to hear from Russell if he has thoughts on how to build the sense of fun if you, like most libraries, are publicly funded, and where you kind of have to be careful with tone and kind of what you say. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. So step one, do not do a Trump tweet with like pissing in it, like I did at Wellcome. So that's something that I cannot do at the National Library, and I haven't been able to do it at any of the other places. But I think what is really important is finding those opportunities for fun. Years before I joined the National Library of Scotland, on Twitter especially, it always had a really gentle tone. It was like, whereas Wellcome Collection might be a bit sassy and a bit pointed with its fun, the National Library of Scotland was always very gentle and sweet, and quite homely. So I think there's lots of different levels and ways of doing fun. So yeah, I think especially being libraries, I think there's a lot of fun can come from the other complication with libraries is copyright. Probably everyone on this call like understands that too. So it's about finding the ways that you can have some fun with the content and the collections at your disposal. But yeah, in terms of bringing the fun in, I think you can do that. I think you just bring your personality to it and you just pitch it accordingly. So um, I think easy does it probably is the best way to go for libraries. And just imagine, I guess, that you're having like a coffee morning maybe with some readers and think about that kind of level of fun. Whereas Welcome Collection was an adult focused venue which covered all sorts of things from like sex to disease to all sorts of different weird stuff. So there was a license there to be a little bit more provocative. Whereas for a library, you can tone the provocative down, but you can sort of up maybe the sort of the charm and the gentleness and the sweetness. I also realize that all of those things are subjective and there's no hard and fast rules to any of this, but I think it's about testing it out, and just if you find something a bit strange in the collections or something fun happened, like just try it out on social and see what happens. Yeah, that's not a super specific answer, but I think it's just about feeling it out and just almost acting as if you're with actual human beings, and you're not going to just be really straightforward and strict. You're going to have a little bit of personality and be a bit bubbly or whatever is appropriate for your organization. So I would just try and channel that as much as you can and then see how it goes.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to ask one final question, and I hope we can uh, uh, kind of get there. What do you see for the future of digital creativity in libraries? I know that's a big question for a short period of time.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. That's such an easy question. Crikey, that's really big. Okay, so do you know what? I think I would like to see more libraries providing opportunity for creativity, maybe rather than them necessarily themselves being the people pushing the creative content, maybe it's about providing ways in for people to be inspired and to use collections or use the stories that they hold to tell something really cool. And because it can act as inspiration, but then for a whole range of creativity, you can just harness your audience's talents and skills and perspectives. And I think there's something really powerful in being able to open that door to them so they walk in, do something amazing, and then you can be like, look at this, look at this really cool thing that this reader made based on, or whatever it is. So I think, yeah, empowering and inspiring others to create cool, mad, unexpected things would be really cool. Um, yeah, and just a quick flip side to that would be, instead of thinking about what the next shiny, cutting edge, cool digital thing could be, I feel like libraries could be really well placed, possibly, to do something a little bit slower, a little bit calmer, whether that's maybe more in the world of podcasting or something that's just a bit more considered and there's a word onto my tongue, I can't think of what it is, but just something that's just a little bit more like, you can sort of like a warm bath rather than like an exciting, oh my god, this is the cutting edge of digital and look at this organization that's doing it. Maybe it's about just slowing down and being a bit more analog, bringing analog back to the digital in a way, slower, calmer. I don't know, there's two slightly random responses to that.
No, not random at all. I think we all mirror your responses there, and let's hope so. The perfect venues, and the perfect people working in libraries to deliver that. Russell, thank you so much